Welcome to this, our second lecture, where I'm going to talk about the conflict between Catholics and Protestants, specifically in England. Obviously, the American colonies are going to begin as English colonies, so it's important that we have some understanding of this background. Now, hopefully you've watched the first of our lectures where I discussed the Protestant Reformation and the split in Europe between the Protestants and the Catholics. In England, while this is happening, Henry VIII will be king, and he will be married to Catherine of Aragon, whose brother is the extremely powerful and extremely Catholic King of France. And so for England, which was a relatively unimportant kingdom when Henry VIII came to the throne, this is a big alliance. But Henry VIII is getting increasingly frustrated with Catherine of Aragon as she is unable to give him a male son. Now we'll find out this is probably Henry's fault and not hers. But Henry's also getting closer and closer to Louis, the King of France. And so, for political reasons as well as personal reasons, he decides to seek a divorce from Catherine. He also has a mistress named Anne Boleyn, and there's a lot of kind of romance about this, as if he fell so madly in love with her that he had to marry her. This doesn't make a lot of sense, because Henry slept with whoever he wanted anyway. He cheated on Catherine constantly. In reality, Anne Boleyn was the beautiful, granted, daughter of a powerful Protestant family, and Henry's movement towards her wasn't simply lust, although I'm sure there was some of that. It probably also had a lot to do with him removing himself from the Catholic Church. Also, incidentally, some historians believe that Anne Boleyn she was polydactyl. She had 6 fingers on each hand. I don't know if that's true, but I don't know how hot she was. The 6-finger thing would have killed her for me personally. Anyway, Henry was seeking this divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope wouldn't give it to him. Now, he had a decent argument for the time, because Henry and Catherine were, I don't remember how far apart, but they were cousins, some degree removed. And typically the Pope would have gladly given a powerful king the divorce, but Catherine of Aragon was the King of Spain's sister, and so the Pope didn't want to upset the King of Spain. So Henry was kind of trapped, unable to get his divorce. So what Henry is going to do is he's going to decide he's a Protestant. He will leave the Catholic Church and grant himself a divorce, because Henry's version of Protestantism doesn't change any of the philosophy or the belief about religion. All it is the Catholic Church, except you remove the Pope as the head of the Church and you replace the Pope with Henry. And therefore Henry can grant himself a divorce. Now this really made no one happy, because if you were Catholic you were angry because he's renounced the Pope, but if you were Protestant you weren't very happy because he didn't adopt all those Protestant beliefs about a more personal relationship with God. It looked exactly like Catholicism, except he scratched the Pope's name out and put Henry. Well, Henry's love life is going to be complicated. He's going to catch Anne Boleyn cheating on him and cut her head off, and then he's going to marry another powerful Protestant daughter, Jane Seymour, who's going to die giving birth to his only son, Edward. He'll eventually, actually, soon after that, he'll marry Anne of Cleves, a woman from the Netherlands, who's a very powerful Protestant country, seeking to create an alliance. He'll marry her based on a portrait that a painter painted for him, and then when she arrives in England, he decides the portrait was misleading and she's actually extremely ugly in his eyes. Although ironically, she'll be the only one of these women who he'll remain friends with over a long period of time. But he will divorce her. In fact, it may even be an annulment. They're barely married at all. Then he's going to marry Catherine Howard, a young, beautiful woman who Henry's in his 50s at the time. He's over 300 pounds, and he has a festering wound on his leg, but he'll also divorce her, or he'll execute her, cut her head off. And finally, Catherine Parr, who's basically an old woman to take care of him until he dies, and he'll die married to her. Now, Henry's decision to leave the Catholic Church didn't have so much to do with love, and it didn't even really have a lot to do with the divorce. What it probably most had to do with was the fact that if you left the Catholic Church, you no longer had to pay taxes to the Pope. And in fact, a lot of the Germanic and Scandinavian leaders who also became Protestants, this was probably their primary motivation. This is talked a lot about as if like people had these really heartfelt changes in belief about religion. That's probably not true. What was really probably going on is if you were a king or a prince, you realized you didn't have to give the Pope huge amounts of your money if you left the Catholic Church, and more importantly, you could seize all the land held by the Catholic Church in your kingdom, which was usually an enormous amount of land, and very good land at that. So in reality, what Henry was doing was cutting off the Pope, or keeping the Pope's hand out of his pocket, while at the same time seizing the land of the Catholic Church. So we should probably think about this more as a struggle over power and wealth than any sort of deep-held religious beliefs. Anyway, Henry VIII died with 3 children. Edward, who was a sickly boy, Mary, who was raised a Catholic, and so that was problematic. Mary's mother was Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, who was, of course, devoutly Catholic. And then Elizabeth. Now, both the daughters were older than the son, but the son got the throne because he's a boy, right? Elizabeth's mother, by the way, was Anne Boleyn, his first or his second wife, whose head he cut off, right? But Elizabeth and Edward were Protestants, unlike Edward. Elizabeth and Edward were Protestants, unlike Mary, who was a Catholic. So when Henry dies, his son Edward comes to the throne. But he's not able to hold on to the throne very long. Like I said, he's very sickly, and he dies fairly young, just a few years after Henry dies. And that brings to the throne Mary. Now, we call her Bloody Mary because she is going to attempt to undo Henry's transition to a Protestant church. It was called the Anglican Church, Anglican meaning English. And she is going to repress Protestants. She's going to have them literally butchered in the street. She's going to seize their land, and she's going to cause a massive religious war in England. And so she gets this name, Bloody Mary. Now, at one point she believes she's pregnant and she's about to have a son. But it turns out that pregnancy was a phantom pregnancy. And in fact, it may have been stomach cancer that was misdiagnosed as pregnancy, which is terribly sad. Anyway, just a few months later, she died of a stomach ailment. Which was a really important event in history, because if she would have had the son and the Catholics would have held the throne of England, everything would have turned out much differently. But she did die, so now Henry has only one child left, Elizabeth. Elizabeth I will take the throne, and she'll be one of the most important and powerful women in all of human history, and possibly the most important monarch in the history of England. She's called the Virgin Queen because she never marries. If she were to marry, she would give up a lot of her control over England. And so Elizabeth would say, I am married, I'm married to England. If she married a Spanish prince, for example, she would be turning England over to Spain. But Elizabeth ruled for decades and decades. Sorry about that, it does that all the time, I don't know why. Elizabeth ruled for decades and decades until eventually the idea of England reverting back to Catholicism seemed pretty remote. Protestantism had been so well established. And when she dies in 1603, the King of Scotland, who was a relative of this family, Elizabeth obviously had no kids, she never got married, but James I will become king. Now, there was a lot of hope among Catholics that James I would either revert the whole kingdom to Catholicism, even though he was technically a Protestant. People suspected he was secretly Catholic, or that he would just go easier on the Catholics and allow them to return to power in some ways. But he didn't, which surprised a lot of people, really. Now, this created a lot of anger among Catholics who would assume that once Elizabeth died and James came to power, that they would have a better time of it. Some of these Catholics organized what's called today the Gunpowder Treason. They packed a storage room. They packed a storage room below Parliament. That's the British, where the government meets, full of gunpowder, and planned to blow it up when James and importantly all of his sons were there, which would leave no direct heir to the throne, and the Catholics thought they could seize control. Unfortunately for these Catholics, the man whose job it was to light this gunpowder was discovered. His name is Guy Fawkes. You've probably seen this mask here. That's a Guy Fawkes mask. In the wake of the gunpowder treason, the British government would go far and wide, arresting basically all Catholics that they could find and torturing a lot of them. This was kind of a post 9/11 reaction, but this was in 1605. And this will demonize Catholics much more than they already had been, because this was a great act of terrorism, an attempt to overthrow the government. And this would really freak out a lot of people in England. And this is important to understand because it is in this context, 2 years later, that the first permanent colony in America is established at Jamestown, 1607. And of course, Jamestown is named after King James in the colony of Virginia, which is named after Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. And so this conflict, particularly this English paranoia about Catholics, is really woven right into American history right from the beginning. By the way, November 5th is still celebrated in England as Guy Fawkes Day. And this is kind of this creepy anti-Catholic holiday. And this is where they get the whole idea of dressing up as Guy Fawkes, and then they would chase him around and burn dummies of Guy Fawkes in effigy wearing the mask. So if you've ever seen that mask at maybe a protest or in the movie V for Vendetta, that's where it comes from. Now you know. All right, and that really sets us up to understand the political background for the beginning of the colonization.